There is a sandwich your great-grandmother made that she never wrote down, never named, and never once felt the need to explain. It cost 3 cents. It kept a child standing through a Saskatchewan winter. And the reason you have never heard of it is not because it was bad. It is because the generation that ate it decided, the moment they could afford to, that they would never speak of it again. Hi, my name is Jeff, and this is Forgotten Canadian Foods. Number 25, lard and salt sandwich. Start here because this is where the Depression started. A slice of homemade bread spread with soft white lard pulled from the tin on the back of the stove and salted. That is the entire recipe. No embellishment, no additions, no apology. Prairie farmhouse diaries from the 1930s record it without commentary. The way a person records the weather. Had bread and lard. Children ate. The fat and the starch together gave the body what it needed to keep warm in a house where the fire had been banked down to save wood overnight. A pound of lard cost 8 cents in 1932. A loaf of homemade bread cost nothing because it was made from the flour in the bin. This was not a recipe. This was arithmetic. We look at food waste as a modern problem. Our great-grandmothers would look at the way we throw out half a loaf every week and find that genuinely impossible to understand. Number 24, mustard and bread. You may be reading this thinking surely there is more to it than that. There was not. Yellow mustard powder mixed to a paste with a splash of vinegar, spread on bread, folded in half, and eaten standing up before a school day. In homes where the meat had run out and the eggs were being saved for trade in town, mustard was the protein stand-in, and nobody used that phrase because nobody had heard it yet. They just knew mustard on bread filled the gap. Prairie children carried these to the one-room schoolhouse in a tin pail alongside every other child who was carrying the same thing, and not one of them thought to comment. Oral histories from rural Saskatchewan describe the smell of mustard sandwiches as the smell of school itself. And I cannot decide whether that is heartbreaking or strangely comforting. Number 23, fried bologna sandwich. Thick slices, nicked at the edges so they would not curl, laid into a hot cast iron pan until the edges crisped and the center domed up proud. The smell called children to the kitchen without a word spoken. White bread, yellow mustard, a dill pickle if you had one. Tuesday night supper, from Sudbury to Saskatoon, no explanation required. A whole roll cost under 30 cents in 1955, and in working-class Canada, the Depression never fully left a mother's thinking. Fried bologna was always the answer. It still is. Number 22nd, dripping sandwich. After a roast or a pot of salt pork, the pan held liquid gold. Rendered fat and dark meat juices poured into a crock, set on the cold windowsill, and firmed overnight into a dense brown spread. Cold on bread, it was the whole roast dinner compressed into 3 bites. British and Eastern European immigrants recognized it immediately. What is old in Yorkshire is old in Winnipeg. German settlements east of Saskatoon kept the dripping crock on the table. All winter. Replenished every butchering time. In the 30s, the question was never whether it appealed, only whether there was anything else. Number 21, syrup sandwich. When there was nothing sweet in the house but the molasses tin or the bottle of corn syrup, a mother poured a thin stream over a slice of bread, folded it, and handed it to a child as if it were a treat. For that child, it was. Blackstrap molasses cost 20 cents a tin in the 1920s, and it lasted months. It gave iron and sweetness, and a flavor children in the hungry 30s associated not with poverty but with small, certain pleasure. Prairie grandmothers in their 90s mentioned the syrup sandwich first, not with shame, but with something that sounds like fondness. The ingredient was cheap. The memory was not. Number 20, pickled green tomato sandwich. Every prairie garden produced more tomatoes than the frost would let ripen. Come September, a woman stood with a bushel of hard green tomatoes and 2 choices: waste them or put them up. She did not waste them. Slice thin, Brined in vinegar and salt with mustard seed and dill, they went into mason jars and came out all winter as a sharp, bright condiment that cut through every heavy meal the cold demanded. Bread, lard, 2 slices of pickled green tomato, you had summer preserved in brine. A pantry full of those jars was a pantry full of confidence that January would not win. Number 19, potato sandwich. A potato sandwich, yes. Cold boiled potatoes, sliced the morning after supper, laid between 2 pieces of bread with lard, salt, and sometimes a thin smear of mustard. This sounds impossible until you eat one, and then it sounds like the most obvious thing in the world. Prairie root cellars held potatoes through any winter, and in the worst years of the 30s, entire families ate them at every meal for months because the alternative was nothing. The potato sandwich was cold lunch by the same logic. It traveled to school in a tin pail, kept without spoiling, and cost almost nothing. Before you object, a chip buddy is just a hot potato sandwich, and the British have been defending those with their lives for 100 years. Number 18, dandelion green and vinegar sandwich. Every April, after a prairie winter that ran from October to May without a single fresh vegetable, the first dandelion leaves appeared, and homestead women were outside with a pail before breakfast was finished. Picked young, the leaves were tender and sharp. On bread with vinegar and salt, they tasted like spring arriving after 6 months of root vegetables and salt pork. Medical records show dandelion season corresponded with an immediate drop in the vitamin deficiency symptoms prairie doctors knew too well. Our great-grandmothers did not know the clinical word for what they were correcting. They just knew to go out the moment the leaves appeared. They were right. The dandelions are still in every yard. Most of us walk past them without a thought. Number 17, head cheese sandwich. November was butchering time, and not one part of the pig went to waste. The head went into the largest pot with peppercorns, bay leaves, vinegar, and onions, simmered until the meat lifted clean from the bone. Women shredded every scrap, mixed it with the reduced cooking liquor, packed it into bread pans, and left it overnight in the cold cellar. By morning, it had firmed into a dense, spiced, sliceable terrine. On bread with mustard, this was the cold lunch every farm child carried to school for weeks after butchering. Mennonite oral histories from Steinbach describe whole neighborhoods gathering, each family going home with a share of everything. Nothing bought, nothing wasted. Today, head cheese sits behind deli glass priced like a delicacy. Our grandmothers made it because throwing away the head was simply unthinkable. Number 16, mustard pickle and cold pork sandwich. If one jar sat on every prairie table from 1890 through 1970, it was mustard pickle. Green tomatoes, overgrown cucumbers, cauliflower, green beans, pearl onions, the garden's entire end-of-season surplus, brined overnight and cooked in vinegar, mustard powder, turmeric, and sugar until the whole kitchen turned the color of a summer afternoon. Into mason jars, through every winter, onto the table with everything. Cold boiled pork on bread, topped with a generous spoonful. The vinegar and mustard cut through the fat in a way that turned a leftover into something worth looking forward to. The recipe survives in handwritten notebooks and church cookbooks nobody has digitized. If your grandmother had one of those notebooks, go find it now. Number 15, salt pork and onion sandwich. Salt pork was the anchor protein of the homesteading era. Packed in wooden barrels in enough brine to last a Saskatchewan winter, it cost under 15 cents a pound in 1912 and fed a family the better part of a week. Fried until the fat rendered golden and the edges crisped, leftover slices went cold into a sandwich the next morning with thin rings of raw onion on top. The onion cut the salt and fat with a sharp, clean bite that woke the whole thing up. No refrigeration needed. The salt did the preserving. Prairie oral histories describe salt pork and raw onion as the smell of harvest, the smell of men who had been working since sunrise with 4 hours still to go. Number 14, Creamed sardine sandwich. Portuguese and Scandinavian immigrants who settled the prairies and the maritime coasts arrived with centuries of knowledge about preserved fish, and they applied it immediately. A tin of sardines was mashed with a fork, mixed with a small spoonful of vinegar, a pinch of salt, and a drop of mustard until it became a rough, spreadable paste. This went on to bread as a cold lunch that cost less than 10 cents, and it provided more protein per slice than almost anything else in the Depression pantry. Fishing families along the Atlantic coast ate variations of this daily. Prairie families who had no access to fresh fish kept tinned sardines on the shelf, the way other families kept salt pork in the barrel as the reliable protein you could count on when everything else had run short. My grandmother kept tinned sardines in her cupboard until the day she died at 93, and she called it good sense. She was correct. Number 13, peanut butter and lard sandwich. Before anyone called it a snack, peanut butter was a Depression-era calorie delivery system, and the prairie families who could get it understood that immediately. Mixed with an equal amount of lard and spread thick on bread, it produced something denser and more sustaining than peanut butter alone, with enough fat to carry a child through a cold school morning without flagging. I can feel you making a face. The lard adds richness without sweetness, and in the 1930s, sweetness cost money that most prairie families did not have. The combination of fat, protein, and carbohydrate in a single slice was not a coincidence. It was the result of women making calculations every morning that nobody ever thanked them for making. A jar of peanut butter cost about 25 cents. The lard was rendered at home. The entire sandwich cost under 2 cents per person. Number 12, bean paste sandwich. When the navy beans had been simmering all night and the morning meal was finished, there were always beans left. Prairie women mashed the remainder against the side of the pot with a fork, seasoned it with a pinch of salt and sometimes a small pour of the cooking molasses, and spread it cold on bread for the midday meal. Bean paste sandwiches appeared in every settlement east of Saskatoon. In Ukrainian communities, German communities, Mennonite communities, and in the homestead farmhouses of every family who understood that throwing away cooked food while children were hungry was simply not something a sensible person did. The paste was dense and faintly sweet from the molasses and slightly smoky from the salt pork it had been cooked alongside. It traveled well, it kept well, it cost nothing because the beans had already been paid for at supper. The most ingenious meals in Canadian history are the ones that started as leftovers and got better. Number 11, canned salmon and vinegar sandwich. Pink canned salmon was a Canadian pantry staple long before supermarkets existed, and in the 1930s it was the affordable protein hundreds of thousands of families relied on every Friday. The tin was emptied into a bowl, mashed with a fork, mixed with a splash of vinegar, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a few drops of mustard, and spread on bread. A tin of salmon cost about 30 cents in 1935 and fed 4 people. Some families ate this every single Friday of the year without variation, and the grandchildren still remember the smell of the tin being opened. Vinegar is the essential detail. It cut the richness of the fat and brightened the flavor of the fish in a way that made the whole thing taste fresh, even from a tin that had been sitting on the shelf since August. Salt and acid, 2 ingredients that cost nothing and change everything. Number 10, Cretin's sandwich. In Quebec, Cretins appeared on the breakfast table every morning, spread thick on toast, as natural and unremarkable as the sunrise. Ground pork and fat simmered low and slow with milk, onion, cloves, cinnamon, and savory, until the mixture thickened to a pale, grainy paste. Poured into crocks and set in the cold to firm, it kept for weeks and was spread on bread at every meal of the day. As a sandwich, filling it was rich, sweet with spice, deeply porky, and deeply satisfying. A batch cost about 40 cents and lasted a family 2 weeks. Every grandmother in Quebec had her version, and every version was claimed to be the definitive one. This is still true today, and the arguments about whose cretins were best have lasted longer than any winter. The rest of the country never fully adopted this, and that is a genuine loss. Number 9. Fried AG and salt pork sandwich. On mornings when a family could spare an egg, it went into the same pan the salt pork had just vacated, frying in the remaining fat until the whites set and the edges crisped, golden in the pork drippings. Laid on bread with the egg still warm and a slice of the fried pork underneath it, this was breakfast and lunch folded into one. Farm families kept their own chickens and eggs were available through most of the year, which meant this sandwich occupied a tier above the pure austerity meals and below the meals that required a trip to the general store. It was the sandwich that meant things were going reasonably well this week, which in the 1930s meant more than it sounds. The salt pork fat frying the egg gave it a flavor that plain butter never achieved. Prairie cooks knew this without any culinary theory to explain it. They just kept the pork fat in the pan, and the results spoke for themselves. Number 8. Dandelion and bacon fat sandwich. The Maritime Spring version of the dandelion sandwich was slightly different from the Prairie version, and the difference was bacon. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick households, the bacon fat left in the pan after breakfast went directly over a pile of young dandelion leaves, wilting them slightly, and the whole dressed pile went onto bread with a crack of black pepper. The bitterness of the dandelion and the smokiness of the bacon fat worked together in a way that tasted like something worth paying for at a restaurant. That makes it particularly funny that this was the free food, the emergency food, the first spring food that cost nothing beyond the walk to the riverbank and the willingness to bend over and pick. After a maritime winter with nothing fresh on the table from October to May, this sandwich hit the table in late April like a message that the worst was over. Number 7. Cold bannock sandwich. Flour, lard, baking powder, salt, and enough water to bring it together. Mixed in the hand, shaped into a flat round, cooked in a greased skillet until the outside crisped golden, and the inside stayed soft and doughy. Bannock was the bread that built the West, and it traveled everywhere. The cold version, made the night before and packed the next morning, was the sandwich bread of the bush. You split a piece of cold bannock and filled it with whatever was available. Salt pork if there was any. Bean paste if there was not. A smear of lard and a pour of molasses if there was nothing else. Eaten cold, bannock had a density and a richness that white sandwich loaves never achieved. Indigenous communities across the prairies had been making versions of this bread long before European settlement arrived, and the homesteaders who learned from their neighbors ate better for it. This is a bread that got pushed off the table when white sandwich loaves arrived by rail, and I still have not forgiven the railway for that. Number 6. Blood sausage and mustard on dark bread. The pig gave everything, and the blood was no different. Caught in a clean pail at butchering, seasoned with salt, pepper, marjoram, and cooked barley, then packed into casings and poached gently. Blood sausage was the first meat eaten after butchering because it kept the shortest time. Sliced thick and fried until the edges crisped, then laid on dark bread with a good smear of mustard. This was a supper that cost nothing beyond what was already in the kitchen. German, Ukrainian, and Hungarian grandmothers made it in the style of the old country. The seasoning was a point of family pride. The recipe passed without ever being written down. Today, blood sausage appears at specialty counters. Restaurants call it boudin noir and price it accordingly. On the Prairie homestead, it was the sandwich that appeared the week after butchering and disappeared just as fast, because everyone ate it as quickly as they could before it stopped keeping, which is the same way they ate everything else worth eating. Number 5, vinegar pie sandwich. This one requires a moment of explanation. Depression-era prairie women called vinegar pie by different names. Transparent pie. Poor man's lemon pie. Eggs, sugar, butter, flour, water, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar were beaten together and baked in a lard crust. It set firm and tasted faintly, inexplicably, of citrus. There was no lemon, there was acid and sweetness, and the combination fooled a hungry palate into something that felt like a treat. Prairie women brought this to church socials in the 1930s without announcing what was in it, and people ate second slices without suspicion. Now here is where the sandwich comes in. A thick slice of cold vinegar pie set between two pieces of bread was the Depression dessert sandwich. The children who carried these to school called it a pie sandwich, and they were right to be pleased about it. An entire generation grew up believing their grandmothers made a tart custard pie from a recipe that could never quite be reproduced. It was never secret. The ingredients cost less than a dime. It was just easier not to explain. Number 4, salt cod and potato sandwich. Along the Atlantic coast, salt cod was not a heritage ingredient. It was the basic protein fishing families depended on all year. Soaked overnight to draw out the brine, then boiled, flaked, and mashed with cold boiled potato, a pinch of salt, and a drop of mustard until it became a rough, dense paste. It went on to bread as the cold lunch that kept maritime working families fed through every month of the year when no fresh fish was available. A whole dried salt cod cost less than $1 and made enough filling to feed a family of 5 for several days. The Maritimes built themselves on this fish. In Acadian communities across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, some version of salt cod and potato has been on the table every week for 300 years. Today, it is considered a heritage dish. For 3 generations of maritime grandmothers, it was just Thursday. Number 3, rhubarb spread sandwich. Here is the one food historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Rhubarb was the daily meal of the Métis Nation and the fur trade brigades, dried meat packed in fat, dissolved in boiling water, and thickened with a handful of corn flour into a dense, nourishing porridge. In the homesteading era, prairie grandmothers of Métis heritage adapted it. When the pemmican was gone, dried venison or moose, pounded fine, and mixed with rendered fat and dried Saskatoon berries, was pressed into a spread. Onto bannock or bread, it produced a sandwich that delivered fat, protein, and carbohydrate in 3 bites. It required no refrigeration, kept through any weather, and sustained a working man through a full day of hard physical labor in temperatures that stopped being described once they passed 40 below. Elder knowledge keepers in Métis communities across the prairies are actively working to preserve this preparation, understanding that what is at stake is not just food, but the memory of how this land fed its first peoples, and how that knowledge kept everyone who came after them alive. The Hudson's Bay Company's entire Western enterprise ran on the principles behind this sandwich. We now call the concept an energy bar, and we sell it for $4 at the airport. Number 2, Friday bread with lard and molasses sandwich. This was what my grandmother made every Friday. Not because Friday was special, because the week's bread was finished, and this was faster than waiting for yeast dough to rise. A quick dough, 2 loaves, pulled hot from the oven, sliced thick immediately. Each slice got a scrape of lard and a pour of blackstrap molasses. The lard melted into the warm bread, the molasses spread, dark and bittersweet over everything, and then you folded it into a sandwich before it dripped. Prairie families called this the Friday bread, the bread nobody had to be called twice for. Molasses cost 20 cents for a tin in the 1920s and lasted months. The lard was rendered at home. The entire sandwich cost under 3 cents per person. When I make this now, my children think it is a recipe I invented. This was not invention. This was the whole country at supper for 50 years, every Friday, from the Red River to the Rockies, And the reason you have never seen it on a menu anywhere is that the people who ate it decided their children would grow up eating something else. And they meant it as a gift, and it was. Number 1, the everything sandwich. There was no formal recipe for this one. There was a loaf of bread, whatever was left in the house, and a mother standing at a kitchen counter in January, in a house where the temperature had dropped overnight and the flour bin was getting low, the dripping crock from last week's pork, the last 2 spoonfuls of mustard pickle, a scrape of cold bean paste, half a sardine from a tin that had been opened at noon, a few rings of raw onion, a smear of lard because there was always lard. It went between 2 slices of bread, and it was called dinner. Prairie Homestead diaries from the 1930s and 1940s record meals like this without drama, used what was left, made sandwiches, children ate. The genius of this sandwich is that it had no fixed form, only a fixed logic. Nothing gets wasted. Everything that can feed a person feeds a person. The woman who made it never called it resourcefulness, never called it creativity, never called it survival cooking. She called it getting supper on, and it was always enough. 25 sandwiches, 1 story. These were not recipes from cookbooks. They came from cold cellars, hard winters, and women who had learned that the distance between a child going hungry and a child going to school full was sometimes as thin as a piece of bread, and whatever was on the shelf beside it. That knowledge is mostly gone now, lost somewhere between the delivery app and the artisan deli counter. If your grandmother made any of these, she knew something the grocery store never taught. The calculation she made every morning before you woke up, the one that turned almost nothing into enough, that calculation was not a recipe. It was a skill, and it is almost gone. Tell me in the comments which one your grandmother made, and tell me if you still have her tin